So you hear about it constantly, right?
Yeah.
This global trend of falling birth rates.
Oh, yeah. It's this huge demographic shift, kind of reshaping societies everywhere.
Totally. And it naturally leads you to wonder, well, can governments actually step in and, change this?
It's a really big question, significant implications. And it's certainly one that policymakers around the world are grappling with.
Yeah.
Many have definitely tried to influence these trends, various interventions.
And that's exactly what this deep dive is all about today. We've got this fascinating report looking closely at 3 specific countries, Sweden, France, and Russia. And all of them have put in place pretty substantial policies trying to boost their fertility rates after, they'd started to fall.
Right. And these 3, they make for a really interesting comparison because, well, they represent quite different policy philosophies, different contexts for tackling this challenge.
How so?
Well, you've got Sweden really focused on gender equality, then France with its long-standing, very comprehensive family support system.
Okay. And then Russia, more recently emphasizing sort of targeted financial incentives, different angles.
Got it. So our mission today is to really unpack this report. We'll dig into the specific policies they tried, what the report says actually happened, the impact, and I think critically, what larger lessons the report suggests we can learn about whether governments can truly, reverse falling fertility.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, the report's main conclusion, it might surprise you. It definitely pushes back against some common ideas.
It does. It offers let's say, a rather sobering perspective, really grounded in historical observation.
Okay, well, let's get into it. Let's maybe start by unpacking the individual cases in the report. Sweden first. The report calls their approach the gender equal approach.
Right. So Sweden, they saw a notable dip in their fertility rate back in the early 90s, dropped to about 1.5 children per woman.
Wow, quite low.
Yeah. And the report links this, partly anyway, to an economic downturn, but also significantly to more women entering the workforce.
And their policy response was, well, pretty comprehensive. And yes, heavily focused on that gender equality piece.
So what were some of the key policies the report mentions for Sweden? I think you said parental leave, childcare?
Yes, exactly. The report talks about Sweden really embracing what's called the dual earner, dual carer model. So key things were incredibly generous paid parental leave.
How generous.
Up to 480 days. And crucially, designed to be shared with specific months reserved just for fathers, the daddy month, to really encourage their involvement.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Plus, universal access to heavily subsidized, high-quality childcare, strong job protections when you return from leave, and generally, policies supporting work-life balance.
Right, making it work practically. And what did the report find about the impact? Did it, work for Sweden's fertility rate?
Well, the report notes that fertility did rise after these policies. It got up to around 1.9 by the mid-2000s.
Okay, closer to that replacement level.
Yeah, and it stayed relatively stable since, particularly if you compare it to the sharper drops seen in many other European countries. So the report's analysis suggests Sweden probably avoided a much bigger demographic slide by intentionally weaving gender equality into their family policy.
So it wasn't just about making it easier to have kids financially, but making it genuinely compatible with modern careers, modern lives for both parents.
That seems to be the key takeaway for Sweden, yes.
Interesting. Okay, so moving from Sweden's model, the report then turns to France. They label France the pro-natalist pioneer. Sounds like they've been at this a while.
They have. France is interesting because its fertility rate actually fell below replacement level quite a bit earlier than many others, back in the 1970s.
Really?
Yeah, dipped to 1.66 by 1993. But, as the report points out, France has had generous, pretty sustained family policies in place for decades. It's baked into their system.
So what does the report highlight as the core parts of France's system? What does it look like?
Well, the report describes France's system as one of the most comprehensive anywhere, really. It includes things like monthly family allowances for every child,
Okay.
extensive, highly subsidized public child care option, the creches,
Yeah.
significant tax credits tied directly to how many kids you have,
Right.
long and pretty flexible paid leave options for both parents, and comprehensive healthcare supporting pregnancy, birth, early childhood, the whole package.
Wow, that sounds like a really deep, embedded societal support structure for families. And the impact, according to the report?
According to the report, these policies have consistently helped France maintain a relatively higher fertility rate compared to a lot of its neighbors. France saw its rate climb back up to around 2.0 by the mid-2000s. That put it among the highest in Europe at the time.
Impressive.
Yeah. Now, it has stabilized a bit lower since then, closer to 1.8 perhaps, but the report still views the French model as a kind of benchmark for a comprehensive, maybe more sustainable approach to family support.
Okay, so both Sweden and France, using maybe slightly different approaches, but both pretty comprehensive, saw their rates rise, moving back towards that 2.1 replacement level after putting these systems in place.
That's right. They saw recovery.
Now let's look at Russia. The report describes a recent approach quite differently, the financial incentive model.
Yeah, Russia's situation was, well, a much steeper challenge. After the Soviet Union collapsed, its fertility rate just plummeted.
How low did it go?
To a really low 1.17 by 1999, just reflecting deep economic, social disruption. So the policy response, especially starting around 2007, was heavily centered on direct financial measures, money.
Okay, what specific financial incentives did the report mention Russia using?
The big one highlighted in the report is the maternal capital program. This was a pretty substantial one-time cash payment.
How much are we talking?
Around $10,000 roughly when it started. And it was specifically aimed at families having a second child.
Targeted.
Very targeted. And this was combined with other financial incentives for housing, education, even retirement savings, plus broader campaigns encouraging larger families.
Right. And what was the immediate effect? Did throwing money at it work?
Well, the report says these financial incentives did have a temporary impact, yes. Russia's fertility rate rose, reaching 1.78 by 2015.
Okay, quite a jump from 1.19.
Definitely a significant increase. However, and this is the key finding from the report on Russia, those gains proved unsustainable. As the report notes, by the 2020s, Russia's fertility rate had started falling again.
So the bumps didn't last.
Exactly, which suggests, in the report's view, that financial incentives alone, while maybe they can create a short-term boost, seem to have limited power to really change long-term fertility trends fundamentally on their own.
Okay, so looking across these three, Sweden, France, Russia, very different contexts, different policy mixes, all implemented policies, all saw some level of increase afterwards. Sweden and France, with more comprehensive, maybe more integrated systems, saw a more sustained recovery towards the replacement rate.
Right. More stability.
Russia, focusing heavily on direct cash, saw a big jump, but it seems it wasn't sustainable. So what's the big picture here? What's the overarching conclusion the report draws from all this?
Well, this is precisely where the report delivers its most significant and maybe, most challenging conclusion.
Okay, I'm braced. What is that key finding, and how does it maybe challenge what people assume about these policies?
The report states pretty clearly that despite all the efforts, despite the temporary increases we saw in Sweden, France, Russia, and this is the critical bit, none of these countries has actually managed to permanently raise their fertility rate back above the replacement level. That's 2.1 children per woman. Once it has fallen below it...
Wait, none of them got back above 2.1 and stayed there?
Not permanently, no. And the report goes further. It asserts, based on looking at the historical evidence, that no country in the modern era has achieved a sustained rebound in fertility above that 2.1 threshold after it's crossed below it.
Okay, that's the part that really makes you pause. Because you hear about these policies, right? And the story's often framed like, oh, governments are fixing it or they're getting rates back up.
The narrative.
But the report seems to be saying, look, maybe they're slowing the decline. Maybe they're creating temporary bumps. Maybe they stabilize things below replacement level. But they're not actually reversing the trend back above that magic 2.1 number.
That's exactly the interpretation. The report argues this pattern, this consistent historical observation, implies that fertility decline once it takes hold in a modern society. It isn't just an economic problem you can fix with subsidies or benefits alone.
So what is it then, according to the report?
The report views it as reflecting something deeper, underlying sociocultural shifts, things intrinsically linked to modern life, changing gender roles, the growing emphasis on individual autonomy, education, choice, especially around forming families.
Right, these bigger, slower-moving societal changes.
Exactly. Things that policy levers might struggle to counteract directly.
So if the report concludes that getting back above 2.1 seems, historically anyway, unprecedented once you've dropped below it, where does that leave policy? What should governments be aiming for then? What's the alternative goal?
Well, the report recommends a pretty significant shift in how we think about policy goals. A reorientation.
Yep.
Instead of fixating purely on hitting numerical fertility targets like getting back to 2.1, the focus, according to the report, should shift. It should be about creating a societal environment, of a whole ecosystem where individuals and couples feel genuinely supported, empowered, able to freely make choices about having children without facing huge systemic barriers.
So less about pushing numbers up, more about removing obstacles and building support.
Precisely. Building trust in the system, creating supportive conditions.
Okay, what specific types of policies does the report suggest actually help create that kind of supportive environment?
It outlines several key pillars. First, it really emphasizes the need for truly holistic, universal family support systems.
Like what we saw hints of in Sweden and France.
Exactly. So this means affordable, high-quality childcare that's accessible right from infancy. Extended, flexible, paid parental leave really designed for both parents to take, and generous child allowances that are actually connected to the real cost of raising kids today.
Makes sense. What else?
Second, the report stresses promoting genuine gender equality, especially in the workplace. This means strong job protections for mothers and fathers, active support for parents coming back to their careers after leave, fostering flexible work arrangements, and actively working to get rid of biases, the so-called motherhood penalty.
Making sure that choosing to start a family doesn't automatically derail anyone's career prospects.
Well, exactly right. Third, the report highlights housing, making sure young families can actually access affordable and suitable housing, maybe through priority schemes or incentives for different family living arrangements.
Housing is huge, yeah.
Fourth, robust support for early childhood development and education, free or subsidized early education, accessible healthcare, support services. The works.
So policies aimed squarely at easing those very real, practical financial pressures of raising kids today.
Yes. And finally, the report also brings in the role of immigration and integration policy.
How does that fit?
Well, it sees immigration as a potential contributor to demographic health, but stresses that this needs to be paired with policies that really support successful integration, things like education access, language support, family reunification.
Okay. So the report is advocating for a much broader, more interconnected societal approach. It's about building these resilient support structures everywhere, not just narrowly focusing on incentivizing births with, say, cash payments like Russia tried.
That's the core shift the report argues for. Moving the goalposts from a numerical target, like 2.1, to creating a society where having kids is genuinely compatible with the realities and the aspirations of modern life.
Right. Compatibility and support. So let's try and sum up the key findings from this deep dive into the report. First big takeaway. Despite all these major policy efforts, temporary bumps in places like Sweden, France, Russia, the report finds that no country, in the modern era anyway, has managed to permanently push its fertility rate back above that critical 2.1 replacement level once it's fallen below it.
Right. A sobering historical reality check. And the report interprets this not just as an economic issue, but as evidence that the decline is fundamentally tied to these deeper, long-term sociocultural changes.
Modern life, individual choice, evolving gender dynamics.
Exactly, those big underlying currents.
Which then leads to the report's big recommendation for policy. Shift the focus. Stop chasing a specific birth number, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe that's not the most productive goal.
Instead, emphasize building these comprehensive social support systems, promote real gender equality, ensure access to essentials, housing, education. Consider immigration thoughtfully, basically create a genuinely supportive environment where families feel they can choose to have children and thrive in today's world.
It's about focusing on compatibility and support, not, coercion or just pure financial nudges.
And the report leaves us with this pretty profound final thought to mull over. That maybe the real lesson here isn't about whether fertility can be artificially forced back up just by targeting numbers, but rather how can societies best build trust, foster confidence in their overall social, economic, cultural conditions.
So that families feel secure, feel fully supported in whatever choices they make about their family size.
Exactly. So what does that shift in perspective mean for how you, the listener, think society should approach this really fundamental challenge?
It definitely changes the lens, doesn't it?